Good day to everyone. Hello there. My name is Mr. Fabian. I'm coordinating the working group on international trade at SM Europe here. Together with my colleagues, we're happy to welcome you all, guests we have from Europe as well as from Asia, to another edition of our webinars. Today, we will be discussing EU-China strategic relations. We believe that the discussion could hardly be more timely given the contemporary era of great power strategic competition with intricate economic, political, and diplomatic interdependencies into the international system. On this backdrop, the European Union has categorized its relations with China under different clusters. I believe many of you know these already. We have cooperation partners, negotiation partners, economic competitors, and systemic rivals. I'm keen to see where we stand today, and we have a suitable cast for you to go through these very important matters. First, I will give the floor. I will introduce everyone before giving them the floor. First, it will be our gracious host, Mr. Iuliu Winkler, member of European Parliament, former Minister of Trade of Romania, Vice Chair in the International Trade Committee, and also standing rapporteur for EU-China relations in INTA. He's also the first Vice President here at SM Europe. So thank you very much, sir, for hosting us, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. I hope I succeeded in unmuting myself. Good morning once again, dear colleagues, dear participants, distinguished panelists. It's so good to see you. I think that indeed, as our moderator has remarked, it's a very timely conversation. And it's, of course, a strategic conversation since our relation with China is a strategic one. If we look back a little bit to 2019, we can remember that we had some visions about 2020, which will be the China year for the European Union. As you remember, we had this important political commitment on both sides that the dialogue, the negotiations on the investment agreement will come to a conclusion in 2020, or they have supposed to come to a conclusion. We had scheduled two major EU-China summits for 2020, and we had high hopes on the evolution of those relations in the context that, of course, 2019 was also the year of the EU-US trade war, or maybe more generally, some elements of trade war of President Trump towards not only China, but also other partners, even the WTO and even the European Union, if we remember correctly. China, of course, is for us and continues to be an essential partner in some global dialogues, for example, the Paris Agreement and on climate action. Of course, China is a negotiating partner, and I just mentioned the investment agreement, but we have to remember also the political dialogue and the negotiations on visa regime and other elements of this bilateral negotiating frame. Of course, China is an economic competitor, and of course, we see it more and more as a very assertive systemic rival to the European Union. This was the end of 2019. We had high hopes. Then 2020 came, and along with it, the coronavirus pandemic. We experienced the lockdown of our societies. We experienced a brutal stop for a huge number of economic sectors throughout all the global economies. And the question comes naturally, is it still 2020, or can 2020 be still the China year for the European Union? In many ways, I think yes, China year is still on the table for us, for the European Union. Equally, of course, it is not only a China year for the European Union. It is maybe a United States year, because in the context of the global volatilities, of course, that our transatlantic relation is very, very important. I would say maybe even more important than in the last decade, anytime. Of course, beyond the trade war phase in 2019, what would be the right answer? And I'm sure that today many valuable contributions can come from our discussion, in the context also that we have a new competition now in these days, namely the competition of who will emerge firstly from the lockdown, which economy can be restarted firstly. And of course, it's a competition with several actors, but I think that US, China, and our European Union are the main actors in this new competition. Many political analysts and economic analysts come and suggest us lately that the EU-China and the EU-US relations are a binary choice for the European Union. And of course, we are so essentially tied with the United States in our transatlantic security, trade, economic stability, and other relations, that some say that we should fully align to the United States and turn away or even turn against China. This is an opinion that I met in the last weeks, coming back again and again, and I would strongly oppose such a binary choice, such a huge simplification. We, the European Union, have to continue building our global relations and our relations with these two important partners, China and the US, on the two pillars that are always at the fundament of our external action. The best interest of the European Union is the first pillar, and the second pillar would be our fundamental values. We call them global values that stand even at the foundation of the European Union. So our interests and our values, that would be our constant point of reference. To conclude these remarks, I would just formulate, I would just give you 5 points about the recovery after the pandemic, after the coronavirus crisis. Of course, in relation of our EU-China trade and economic relations, first of all, we have to reduce our vulnerabilities and our dependencies, which have been very clearly exposed by the coronavirus crisis. Secondly, we have to have a discussion about the strategic sectors of the European economy. We have to better define which are those strategic sectors, and then we have to build on diversification of our supply chains. Thirdly, I think that what was true in 2019 is also true in 2020. We have to enforce the level playing field. And this brings me to point number 4. We have to strengthen the EU trade defense instruments. And even we have to build up a new generation of 21st century trade defense instruments of the European Union in order to give us tools to enforce the level playing field towards all our global partners, but of course towards China also. And lastly, my 5th point is, of course, the European Union has to remain committed to the WTO. We have to search for new allies in our quest to strengthen and modernize the WTO. Those were my comments. I'm looking forward to this very exciting discussion, and I give the floor back to you, Tudor.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Winkler, for that very comprehensive introduction. You rightly pointed out this strategic triangle that we have to currently deal with in terms of the EU, China, US relations. And thank you for your 5 points on the recovery. Now, we will have 2 big keynote speakers. A quick agenda point, His Excellency Ambassador Nicolas Chapuis unfortunately could not make it today anymore due to some unforeseen changes. The EU delegation in China will be represented by Ulrich Weigel, who is the head the trade section. He's been an official with the Commission for a very long time. He's a veteran in the Commission, and he's been working on trade relations for a long time, also on EU-Korea relations. We are now celebrating 45 years of diplomatic relations between the EU and China, and we think it's indeed very valuable to have the contribution of the EU delegation and diplomatic corps here today. So without further ado, Mr. Weigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me all. Thank you very much for this kind invitation, and also from this side, first greetings from Ambassador Chapuis and his apologies for not being able to be with us this evening or this morning in Brussels. Indeed, this is a very important juncture to talk about EU-China relations. We are living in complex times, and the topic of our conversation today is very important, and so I hope I can contribute to that discussion from my perspective as primarily looking at trade and economic relations between the European Union and China. This relationship, and I think it resonated in what Mr. Winkler said, this relationship already was very complex before the virus arrived. And the communication that we adopted in March 2019 is a reflection of that complexity, describing China as a partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival, all at the same time in different domains of our relationship. Now, what has happened these days is adding to that dynamic. Now, let me first look at what Mr. Winkler described as the year 2020 as the China year that we were looking forward. It had to be a significant year because of the ambition that we had set out for this year, because of the work program that the summit in April 2019 gave us to work on, and of course, because of the anniversary that we had just last week on 6 May, 45 years of EU-China relations. And then came Corona. Corona had the most visible and immediate impact on the scheduling of our high-level events. So the EU-China summit, supposed to take place end of March, and the preparatory high-level meeting, the strategic dialogue on the political side, the high-level economic dialogue, the human rights dialogue, all of those should have taken place during the first month of this year, and we had to postpone them. We're currently looking at different times, at different formats to have these high-level exchanges between China and the European Union. But that is not to say that we haven't been in intense contacts. Despite the difficulties, we have remained in touch at all and on all levels. So, for example, we had a phone call between Executive Vice President Dombrovskis and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He on 17 April. We had 2 phone calls between Commissioners Phil Hogan and Thierry Breton and the Chinese Commissioner for Commerce, Zhong Shan, the last one just this Monday, 11 May. And just to name one more example, the investment negotiations have continued at an intense pace with 1 round per month, and we have 2 more rounds of negotiations scheduled, one in May and one in June. So just as examples of the conversation is continuing. Now, if you look at the situation in China, quite a number of things have happened, and much of that has been visible in our look at and reporting on China. I would start with just one element that describes the sheer dimension, size of the stress on the Chinese system, which is shown in the very simple fact that for the first time ever, or at least in a very long time, China has postponed the meeting of the National People's Congress as part of the 2 sessions. We just got announcement that these 2 sessions will now take place finally next week, starting on 21st and 22nd of May 2020. What we have seen in China in terms of the economic side of it, and that will be my focus, has been a double shock, at least a shock on the supply side and then a shock on the demand side. And both will affect policy formulation and our reactions to decisions of China, of how China wants to come out of this. Now let's go back when we saw events emerging in late December, early January. We also, and I should mention this year, saw the enormous personal courage of individuals like Dr. Li Wenliang, who took to social media to alert about the situation in Wuhan. I should also refer to the outstanding and courageous reporting by reporters of, like those of Caixin, and their courage and clarity in talking about what was happening and the effects this had on the health side, but also on the economic side in China. And since the 23 January, that is already, it's almost 4 months now, we have seen Chinese measures and actions put in place to deal not only with the health aspects, the quarantine elements, but also to deal with the economy. Because very quickly became clear that it is, like probably in all our countries, a dual challenge of managing the health issue as much as managing the economic challenge. Now in China, we have seen that the extreme measures and different measures taken about many jurisdictions, localities, and provinces have led to a significant stop in economic activity. Migrant workers were not able to return to their workplaces. Supply chains have fragmented. And I think that is the first observation that is there. When then the Chinese central government tried to restart the economy, it found itself sending mixed messages about priorities being health control as much as getting the economy restarted. Now, the time it took for the economy to restart, the fragmentation, the disruptions we have seen meant that we had not only in China, but also with effects beyond China's border, a supply shock. And if you look at the activity level of Chinese economy today, the latest figure we had that of the large majority of companies who have returned to work, only 4% work now at full or normal capacity. So this way, the outbreak in China has also brought to us and has exposed the complexity of global trade relationships, including with China. And we have that in mind when we talk about, like you do, Mr. Winkler, in your 5 points, when we talk about making supply chains more resilient. And I should like to add here one statement just by my Commissioner Hogan, who said recently, strategic autonomy does not mean that we should aim for self-sufficiency. The complexity of supply chains is such that this would be unattainable. And if we look at China, extrapolating and connecting with a global picture we have on trade and the importance of trade, it would mean considerably rising costs for companies, but also for common Europeans, and maybe additional unemployment, as trade does provide 30 million jobs in the European Union. And if we look at that from China, we know that for many European companies, this is an important market for exports as for them as investors in this country. Now, the spread of the virus across the world has also meant a global demand shock. China simply has lost its export markets, seen from here. And so the direct economic impact on China is remarkably high. We have seen officially acknowledged the first ever recorded negative growth figures, GDP figures, in 40 years. That takes us back to the Cultural Revolution times. And GDP officially fell in the first quarter by 6.8% for year-on-year data, and 9.8% quarter-on-quarter. That is an unprecedented contraction. And if we would then apply our forecasts or forecasts from others like IMF and the World Trade Organization, we hover in a range of plus 1% for the whole year for China, to very sober figures like by the World Trade Organization of minus 4.4 or even lower. Now then, this takes us to the question then of what next for China. What can be and should be policy responses here, and what would be the consequences and effects of China's choices and decisions for the European Union and the way we may be able to carry forward our agenda. And here we come to that point also mentioned by Mr. Winkler of who is coming out first of the crisis. And we do indeed see that China had the the burden of being first afflicted by the virus, but also has the chance of coming out of this, first coming out to normal, but certainly a new normal, because we are not totally lifting all restrictions here. We're not seeing this, and we do hope that the European Union member states can follow soon. Now, in policy making, there is a big concern for Chinese decision makers about domestic developments and about developments abroad. We see that in the conversation here, social stability is crucial for the leadership, and in particular employment. We should not underestimate the significance of this. And food and poverty alleviation remains central. And so we also see China announcing quite a number of support measures, measures to stabilize foreign trade and investment, as well as supply chains, monetary measures, and an increasing variety of fiscal measures, and promises by China that it will open up and reform at this juncture. Now, the real question is then what these measures will be in order to understand how we will come out of it. And for the European Union in particular, the question will be, what will be the mix of these measures, fiscal measures in particular, that China will take, but also mix of policy choices that China will make. And some of these choices we will certainly be able to support, and others may mean an additional or an exacerbated challenge to our interests in these countries. Let me just take a few examples or perspectives of how this might pan out. So if we see consumption-focused measures, that may indeed be promising, notably for all of those sectors who cater to Chinese consumers, and its increasingly affluent middle class, where we might be able to sell. And that is true for our exporters, and we used to have a total trade of close to 200 billion exports to China. Or it's also true for our investors who are present in China for China. It's about short of 10% of our total exports as EU that goes to China, so that is the importance here, just measured by these figures. Now, the Chinese stimulus might also aim at infrastructure, and that resonates with the big spending programs that we have seen after the financial crisis, and is then in turn begs the question, what else would be there today that the money could go into? And hence the question in China then, what about putting all that money into new infrastructure, new technology, new areas for new business activities in the future? So this would be about artificial intelligence, about smart cities, about new apps for mobile applications, new markets or extension of activities like online selling, e-commerce, and the faster rollout of communication networks, for example, like 5G. Now, in a recovery context, and in looking at our interest in that dynamic, fair market access in the opportunities that may emerge is certainly key, and our engagement with China will be very important so that we don't miss out on any opportunities that may be there. Now, new infrastructure also means new sectors, business models, products, and new standards that may have to be developed or may will be developed to govern these new products and business models. Here, as China is coming out, as China was the first out to also use IT applications, mobile phone applications widely in the crisis, there may be a distinct first mover advantage if you only think of health applications. And there may also be a question of how these applications and the standards might be propagated to other countries via the digital Silk Road. So questions we have here. Now, at the same time, we do hear statements in China that praise the state-owned companies for managing the crisis, in ensuring employment, in switching fast to the production of desperately needed medical equipment. Now, if that would mean that we have more of a lack of level playing field, or more of a challenge to our economic operators when competing with Chinese SOEs on an equal footing, then we will have an issue, and we will certainly not refrain from action. Now, in this context, another of your points, Mr. Winkler, is of crucial importance. It is strengthening our internal toolbox, as we have set out doing already for a couple of years. It is about trade defense instruments, it is about investment screening, or about the international procurement instrument, or the question of how can we use competition tools in a more efficient way to address competition activities by state-owned companies. So when we look at that whole dynamic, we see that it may lead to things becoming clearer, sharper in contour, or may become quicker an issue for us to look at. But fundamentally, China will continue being what it is, all at the same time, a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. So in addition to that, the virus experience has added new demands, new imperatives for our action, because we have also areas where we should have both interests in addressing them, like shaping the world after the COVID-19 crisis in areas like health, in alleviating the global economic consequences of the crisis, or cooperating on green recovery. And you have heard my president talking about when we bounce back from the crisis, we should bounce back better, meaning we should not fall back into old patterns of polluting ways of doing that, but make our society a better and a healthier place to be. So for EU-China relations, there are important issues about what choices China will make in that process and how they will be made, so that we can see of how we can engage and where we can need to push and assert ourselves at the same time. Having said this, and for these reasons, some areas could pretty much stand in the forefront of that conversation in the trade arena, and that is about the World Trade Organization and about the investment negotiations in particular. Now, my commissioner has said recently, in this dynamic, in this situation, we need the World Trade Organization more than ever, because it is the guarantor, it is important for an open and rules-based trading system, and that is what we need and when we want to come out of this crisis. This is also, and therefore it is the right moment to enhance the multilateral system and work on WTO reform, first and foremost on a functioning and keeping a functioning dispute settlement system. On this one, we note that China has joined the EU's important initiative to preserve that WTO dispute settlement system in the so-called MPIA. Now, we also talk to China about WTO reform. So what it is that we can do jointly to address the important shortcomings and gaps that we have in the rule book of today. And there, China holds the key to this happening, notably on new disciplines for subsidies, where we urgently need to address these shortcomings in the current rule book. Turning to investment, for the European Union, we can say that we are committed to the end of the year 2020 deadline to conclude the EU-China investment negotiations, but only if China commits to a level of ambition and substance for an agreement that is worth having. And that means three very specific things in our mind that we also get not tired to hold out to China. It is central in this dynamics to see more ambition from China on market access. This is about rebalancing the existing asymmetry in all levels of market openness. And that goes back to the fact that the EU market already is quite open to China, and China needs to make much more efforts to show more ambition to liberalize on its side. Secondly, we need ambitious commitments on state-owned enterprises and on transparency on subsidies, again, to effectively level the playing field and the conditions under which our companies, exporters and investors compete against these companies in China and hope to succeed. And finally, and not least, and that ties into the value agenda you have also mentioned, we need strong commitments on sustainable development and in particular on labor, environment, on climate change standards. Having said this, and put out our ambition and commitment to remain, to succeed with this negotiation by the end of the year. This will depend on China's ambition and readiness to engage on these difficult but necessary issues, so that we can reach the thresholds for conclusion. In conclusion, Mr. Winkler, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of work ahead of us now. The pandemic has serious short and long-term consequences in the European Union and on the Chinese economy, and potentially also on our trade investment relations, besides its major impact on health. We have to analyze these things carefully and follow them in detail to understand what they mean for our engagement. But having said all this, 2020 can still be a very significant year for EU-China relations if China walks the talk. So we need more ambition on WTO reform, on investment negotiations, on SOEs, on subsidies. And in all of that, it's very clear, substance goes over speed. Now, China has next week said so the 2 sessions, the Liangwei. And China is about writing its next 5-year plan, the 14th such plan. And that would be moments for China also to set out its policies, hopefully, but not necessarily courageous policies, but certainly moments for us to also look for pointers in which direction the next steps, the next developments will go. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Weigel, thank you so much. That was an indeed very comprehensive overview. You've talked about our priorities and our ambitions. It is good to know that despite the difficult, complex situation, the conversation is ongoing. And as long as dialogue is there, there's also hope for cooperation. The second keynote speaker is Mr. Jörg Wütke. He's president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. He's a China expert with more than 25 years of experience in China. Currently also the vice president and chief representative of BASF in China. Thank you very much, sir, for joining, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much for the pleasure and honor of joining this group. And it's always fun to be a speaker with Ulrich because he does the heavy lifting already. So for me, that leaves the easy part. I just want to change a little bit the perspective, because actually Ulrich has in a comprehensive manner covered most of the issues, which I'm very grateful for. That leaves me actually just very few points. And I want to start about EU-China importance, in particular the importance that China has for European business, that which of course translates into European jobs. If you look into 2030, between now and 2030, 1/3 of global future GDP growth will be China. And that is more or less as much as the most of the OECD countries generate together. So in a way, that is something we have always to ponder, and we draw this conclusion because actually, despite of everything you see, China is actually quite backward. If you look into the GDP per capita of China, in 2018, the data I have, they were at $9,900 US, which is 16% of the level of the United States, 1/6, and 20% of that of my own country, Germany. Of course, you have the shining examples of the cities where Ulrich and myself are living in Beijing, GDP per capita 23,200, but this still is only 37% of the US level, as well as 49% of Germany. And then you have basically a big chunk of the country, the likes of Gansu, which has a GDP per capita of $4,600, which is 7% of US level and 10% of Germany. That gives you an idea how long this 1.5 billion people country or continent still has to grow and will grow. So containment, forget about it. This is the way this is going to happen eventually. If you just see if China, which is now at the level of GDP from Turkey, is going to reach the level of Spain, that jump forward will basically mean that the Chinese economy will be twice as big as the one of the United States. So in short, we have to deal with this, and we have to deal with this in a manner that is acceptable for European public, for European people, for European business, and for of course, the Chinese on the other side. So we need each other. Already now we have a trade of 1.8 billion euro every day. That means a lot of products that come from China are very well liked and appreciated in Europe, as well as that we have still a very good buyership here in China. In particular, as China comes out of this first, as Mr. Winkler said, you have a situation where, for example, BMW, just to name the companies from my own country, as well as Mercedes-Benz, as well as Audi, as well as my own company, at the end of April, we were higher than we were in April last year. So all of a sudden, there's an explosion of demand in manufacturing that is quite puzzling, frankly, but it helps us a great deal. And the importance of China, the strategic importance of China is that much as 60% of global growth in chemistry is in China, and 50%, 25 million cars, are produced in China, that when Germany went into lockdown, the companies that just mentioned basically made sure that their contractors or their sub-companies, factories in Germany and other places, particularly in Eastern Europe, still keep producing despite a lockdown, because these parts are vital for finalizing the completion of a car in Shenyang, Beijing, Shanghai, and other places. In short, in some factories in Europe, production was kept going because there was a need in China. And as you can see, within no time, these things that are mostly shipped in by planes these days or by trains, because with the ships it takes too long, is how the importance is. So China comes out first. And actually, if China comes out first, European companies come out first. And these European companies, again, basically cause the economic growth some to whatever level to carry on in Europe. So we need that. We need this growth in order to be sustainable. But frankly, also we need the demand from China. And demand really is something I want to explain because it's not really covered in media. The thing in China is that the customers are really demanding and getting more and more demanding, which is a good thing. It drives innovation and it gives European companies the edge. But it also causes Europeans to learn many technologies or many products to be developed here first in order to then basically replicate this in Europe. In short, we have to respond to the demand of a young, thriving Chinese middle class, which helps our engineers and our design institutes and everything back home to keep their job and keep on their feet. I give an example. Mercedes-Benz, the first Mercedes-Benz, typically male most likely, in Germany is buying at the age of 53. In China, the average age of the first time Mercedes-Benz buyer is 35. And in many cases, it's female. So you have these young Chinese that have a gadget-driven life. You cannot imagine what kind of gadgets they want in the cars. And so all these European companies have to develop this here to respond to that need. And this spillover of this innovation, market-driven innovation, ends up in our laboratories and our design institutes and design departments back home. So in a way, it's not just that China is a market that absorbs our products, it actually stimulates innovation back home in Europe by simply being a demanding customership. So we have to maintain this. So we have to be here also, because here, frankly, I always call it the fitness club. Here we build chemical plants virtually by the week. We have an airport. There's a sad story for Germans to talk about. We have an airport here, which is $32 billion, 4 runways built within 5 years. And you cannot even imagine how much European equipment is in that airport and how our engineers learn from that and keep. So in a way, China is a fitness club for us. And if we would not be here, we would be really getting into a hard time back home in Europe. Now, the thing is that actually that's why the European Chamber is trying to maintain the kind of lobbying that we do in order to get part of that. Because I mean, it doesn't help us if China is the fitness club and there's a glass wall and I'm sort of with the nose against the wall. We need the parliament, we need our member states, we need the commission, and we need the delegation here in Beijing in order to actually make sure that this little opening that we have goes further and that we are part of this. I estimate, frankly, from everything that we know, that we lose about 30 billion euro every year by not being able to sell stuff. 30 billion, of course, is not much in comparison to what we do already now, but it causes jobs back home, and it just very often is vital to some of the countries we're dealing with. We need China as a market, and we need the kind of lobbying, the kind of work that you do in Brussels or in Berlin or Paris or other places in order to keep the pressure on, because China is playing offensive. As Reinhard Bütikofer always puts it, we play defensive. And that's the big difference. We have to learn that we are becoming more self-confident in Europe. We are, after all, the largest customer base. We are the largest market for China. And we have every right in order to see that we have the Chinese playing in our backyard and in our region according to our rules. So in a way, I really think that the investment screening is a good thing. I think that the European discussion about you know, what do we do in order to maintain our DNA of open markets, competitive driven, not dominated by state-owned enterprises. It would be ironic that we try to privatize our business for 30 years. And then once we're there, all of a sudden we get back under state rule, but this time from a state that is very far away. So in a way, we also should have a discussion on diversification. Diversification means that we are possibly looking at new places. I can assure you that no one is going to leave China. It's always the same 10% that are leaving China because either head office goes belly up, or they're losing money here, or they give up in entering the market, a failure that the chamber is very sad about. So in a way, this diversification might be that we have to look into products that are of vital strategic importance for Europe. And of course, the coronavirus discussion leads to pharmaceuticals, to healthcare equipment and other areas. So I'm sure that is a necessary discussion. We have to lead this, but we also have to be doing this with an open mind, meaning whatever we diversify, whatever we do in a couple of countries will mean that our organizations get more complex, the cost structure gets more higher, and the customer at the end of the day in the pharmacy or elsewhere has to pay more. So how much are our insurance companies, how much are our customers back home willing to pay for diversification? Something we have to ask ourselves. The other thing that I guess is very important, and Mr. Winkler is very much on top of this, is really to tell China to engage in climate change discussions. I think Corona is sort of taking a bit the oxygen out of the room of the climate change discussion. That worries me a big deal because Corona, you can find a vaccine, but when it comes to climate change, you don't find a second planet. Of course, pandemics would be more cooperation there. We have to really see how we deal with China. Obviously, there was a massive colossal screw up here in November, December, and January until the 20th when it was admitted. And we have to see what we learn out of the fact that China has a real problem communicating this, has a system that actually really prevents the kind of information flow that we require. And we should not be shy asking these questions. But let me also remark that from everything I know and from every intelligence person I meet, there is no linkage whatsoever between a lab in Wuhan and the fact that the virus came out of it. So in a way, we should be talking about reality and not getting distracted by US claims. Now, when it comes to the US, I think Mr. Winkler said it all, I come across this situation all the time. Mr. Wuttke, Europe, what will they decide, with the US or with China? Of course, we have more political overlap with the US. The US in many ways just 1945 has liberated my country and has done all of the above. We are closer to the US despite of everything that comes out of the White House, but we don't have to choose. We have economic interests there, we have economic interests in China. And in a way, what I'm always trying to say is Europe, you don't have to look left and right. You can actually just be confident enough. We are a massive region. We have the economic firepower. We are setting the standards around the world. So just let's do our own reforms and not get distracted. We don't want to choose. We are Europe, let the others choose. So in a way, what I finally would like to say is what is bothering us here in China, and that could be addressed, is political pressure. That's a new one over the last years, meaning party cells in companies, but also this constant bickering of Chinese diplomats in Europe that is causing a lot of problems with our local governments, be it Sweden, be it France, be it elsewhere. This is not good because in a way, we as European companies rely on the goodwill of our own people back home in order to operate here. We need a license to operate. And with this political bickering that China is showing particularly over the last weeks, which is not very helpful. And it's not helpful because that puts a challenge on European business here. Why do you operate in an authoritarian system like China? And of course, it's not just ending there, because we try to sort of keep our human rights situation clear within our factory gates. We cannot change China. A multinational certainly doesn't have the power to even move China, but we can operate within our four walls or four factory gates as we would do this in Frankfurt or in Lyon or in Milano. So in a way, that's really important to us to communicate that we don't sort of trash our European values in this country. At the same time, we have to be humble enough to see what we can do and how we can move the needle. But we should oppose this political pressure. We should ask the parliament, our governments, in order to make clear to the Chinese that actually it is not in their own, should not be in their own interest in order to come across as aggressive, abrasive, wolf warrior style as we've seen over the last weeks. It is not in our interest to end up in a situation like in the US, possibly now, where this political pressure leads to the fact that the US government will decide that pension funds cannot buy into companies that operate in China. So you don't just have a market access problem, you actually are getting hurt where it hurts most, at your shareholder price. Thank you very much.
Mr. Wuttke, thank you very much. That was wonderful. You've made a very good case for the importance of China as a strategic partner for the EU. The 1.8 billion trade volume per day, that speaks for itself. Global growth, 50–60% also speaks for itself. You've made it very clear, we do need China. The question still remains, does China need us? We can maybe discuss this later. To conclude, the two gentlemen have had a very constructive contribution for our discussions today. As usual, the rhetoric of the Chinese authorities and the Chinese government is in line with what we like to hear. Again, the question remains to what extent this will materialize into practical policy making. But I will leave my questions maybe for later. For now, we turn to the distinguished discussants of today's meeting. We will start with Anna Michela Simikopoulou, who's a long-serving former member in the Hellenic Parliament and currently Vice Chair in the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament. Thank you, Anna Michela, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you very much for organizing this, colleague Winkler. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for the interesting information. I have a slightly different perspective than you, but interestingly enough, we come to the same conclusions as to what needs to be done. Clearly, China, I'm going to start with what my basic conundrum is, and maybe the gentlemen who have operated in China, so I don't have any on-site experience, can help me resolve this in my own head. And that is, our relationship with China is based on a basic premise. And this premise is that as we engage with them more closely, they will somehow transform from what they are and become more like what we are. I think that if the pandemic has shown anything, and we've described this as weaknesses, definitively, regardless of where one places themselves in the spectrum of intensity of rhetoric, I think we've clearly seen that the Chinese have not been forthcoming with respect to what's happened in this pandemic at an early stage. Now, Liu very, very eloquently said that our relations with China, just like our global relations with anybody, have to be based on the two main pillars of the best interest of Europe. And it's quite clear from the statistics that it's in Europe's interest to have China as a strategic partner and to operate in their markets, but also the second pillar, which is our values. And I think it's completely hypocritical at this point to try to defend the fact that China is operating within our value system. So the question is, what do we do about this? How do we balance between the commercial interests of Europe and its companies and its consumers and our value system? I would prefer not to be pushed into making the binary kind of choices, especially in light of what, at the moment at least, the political situation seems to be in the United States. At the same time, I can't help but wonder if Europe is making the right choices in giving into political pressure in the way we saw with the External Action Service recently on two occasions. One, the report, and two, the letter that was sent out by the ambassadors. So you described a lot of political pressure. Just today, Mr. Burrell said, okay, it was a mistake and we won't be giving in to any of this pressure. So what are we actually going to do about this, and how are we actually going to deal with this? I deal with this situation, and I've dealt with it also in my home country in Greece. As you know, China has been very aggressive through this Belt and Road Initiative, and many countries that were in a difficult financial situation over the past decade, like Greece, have allowed for a lot of Chinese investment. You know that in Greece, for example, I'll just give you some information. In Greece, China has invested through Costco in the port of Piraeus. That is supposed to reach about 1.5 billion euros is supposed to be the total investment when it ends up. Also, they have invested in our electricity grid by buying part of the state company. They're investing in clean technologies in energy. They're paying for ships, Greek ships, to be made in Chinese ports. And we have approximately 6,000 Chinese nationals who are using our golden visa program. So China is quite prominent in the Greek economy. And now Huawei, which is also here, is pushing very hard to get of course, the backbone of the 5G network as it's doing every place. So I just would like to end my small statement with a few questions. And this is taking for granted that I agree that the way forward is to reduce our dependencies and vulnerabilities, to focus on what the sectors are in Europe and see how these are being dealt with in China. The aluminium sector is a case in point, where there's tons of dumping, where China has increased its market share from 10% to close to 60%, doing this through state subsidies clearly, where the 70 billion in state subsidies that have been given are mostly to Chinese companies, where their carbon footprint is 3 times higher than that of European companies. So yes, we need to focus on strategic sectors. Yes, we need to focus on diversifying supply chains, on enforcement, on new methods of enforcement, and on seeing how in the context of WTO, we can make these new alliances that Lilia was talking about. But the truth is that Europe is going to have to make a hardcore strategic decision at the moment. In which direction is it going to go? Is it going to go in the direction where our values clearly point us? And like I said before, regardless of the political leadership or the rhetoric, this is clearly toward the United States. And what's it going to do to safeguard its interests, whether that's our investments and leveling the playing field in China, or what China is about to do? And I don't think we can leave unanswered, and this is my closing remark, we cannot leave unanswered what China may have done in either not disclosing things that have to do with a pandemic, or even worse situations that are being described, and know them through COVID-19 mask diplomacy to come and give masks, which they've done in my country too, and we're very grateful for masks wherever they came from. But Europe can't leave this unanswered unless we've just decided that we're going to accept the fate, or that it's too late and that eventually our value system is going to just yield to the value system that is going to be imposed to us through the Belt and Road Initiative, their investments, or their mask diplomacy. So I would very much welcome your thoughts on the strategic choice that faces Europe, and on really, if you think this is a battle worth fighting, or if it's too late. That is my basic conundrum at the moment. Thank you very much.
Okay, Ms. Asymopoulos, thank you so much for that. You've spiced up our discussions here a little bit, so I'll be very keen to hear what the keynote speakers will have to say about this. In the end, if you gentlemen don't mind, then we will gather the questions from the 3 discussants, and then I'll give you back the floor at the end of their intervention. Okay, without further ado, now we have Mr. Christoph Hansen, who is our EPP coordinator in the International Trade Committee. He's a first-term MEP, but he's a rising star already. He has a lot of experience with the European Parliament, and I'm very happy to give you the floor, sir. Christoph, go for it.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank SME Europe for organizing this very timely meeting, because I think we all know that we have to face enormous challenges when it comes to international trade. First of all, maybe a general remark. I think we should not allow ourselves to be dragged headlong into the narrative that the world is becoming a bipolar again, and that's something where what Julie Winkler rightly pointed out in the beginning of this meeting. So we don't, if we would engage into this confrontational logic, it will be the Trump agenda that will prevail, and I think that's something we all want to avoid. Europe cannot allow itself to be forced to make a binary choice between American or the Chinese model, and I think the European Union should definitely have its own model. And I think we have already proven that we can do so. I think, for example, if we take data protection, where we managed to keep a little bit the middle ground between the Chinese state surveillance and the American laissez-faire. So in my opinion, making a choice or choosing one side or the other would as well be losing out of sight our own strengths, and that's something we should definitely think about. The question is, how can we strengthen and assert our strategic autonomy? Because I think you all know we are interdependent from our different supply chains, but we have to be careful not to be squeezed between the two giants that are out there, and that we will not anyhow be able to change. So a lot of new models are circulating around. Could reshoring, a term that I hear very often in the last weeks, be the answer? Personally, I have a problem with reshoring, which means a little bit taking back what we send once somewhere. So that's for me maybe not the right term to use. Is it how can we build our resilience and autonomy? I think that's something we have to think about. Even if I would allow for the possibility that it can be useful for a few strategic sectors, I do not think it is the panacea that some would believe it to be. So our companies, it is clear, and I think Mr. Wuttke made it clear, need China because it is a very large growth market. We can't, of course, ignore that. And we have to make sure that we will be able to tap into foreseeable future into this strongly growing middle class as well, that is growing strongly in China. We see, you talked about BMW, but we see as well that, for example, Tesla has now finished a factory in close to Shanghai. So I think everybody is betting on this huge growth market that China represents. But we have as well to say that it is business that produces in a given country, not the politics. And it must remain as well a business decision. So I think we shouldn't, in that sense, interfere too much, but let business make their own choices. For me, the better option would be to use China as well. The issue that we have with China to build, again, the bridges with the US that we desperately need in this time. We have to restore the transatlantic relation, and I think the US is as well often criticizing us because of our lax attitude towards China. So I think we have to stand here a little bit stronger up. We have to work to address Chinese systematic competition issues. I think we all agree that forced technology transfer and harmful subsidies is something we have to work against. And I think there it will be very important to have a multilateral fora to address this. And I think if we, together with the US and Japan, address these issues, that we could create a dynamic that could be useful for us on both sides. Firstly, on, for example, industrial subsidy. On that point where China, we hear from Geneva that the ambassador is still very reluctant to engage in any discussion about that. We could put more pressure, and that's why I think that the multilateral fora are very important. But what are now the concrete actions that we should take to enhance our relations with China and really make a huge step forward? And I think there we need something like a loudspeaker, Lautsprecher, you would say in German. There are many German-speaking discussants here at EU level to call out China publicly and sensibly. So we need something like a China Barnier, a task force China to really address the issues that are outstanding. The anti-competitive practices, unfair trade, hostile takeovers. Some of you already talked about it, so I think that would be very important. And then as well, I believe, and here I do not agree with Mr. Woodke that we should a little bit be okay, calm, and not too much provoke the Chinese side. I think that is part of the game, and we shouldn't lose our strengths that we have on the market as well. I think firstly, we have to make sure as well that we get new strategic allies as well in the ASEAN and in general in Asia. I think it is very important that we did our trade agreement with Vietnam. This is putting as well pressure on China, and I think it's important to diversify our partnerships in Asia. That is a very strong element. Why aren't we talking about Taiwan? I know that a lot of people as well here in Parliament are always saying, well, we should not discuss about Taiwan. The deal with China has to be done first, and only then we can move on to Taiwan. I think we can go the opposite round as well and say, well, let's do this. There is a partner that really wants to engage, play by the multilateral rules, and those are not minor partners, even though it's not the same size as China, of course, and then go the other way around and say, well, we arrange things with your close partners, so maybe come to the train as well. And I think that is something that we should think about as well. And then we have as well talked today about the recovery plan and what has to be in there. And Mr. Weigel said it clearly as well. China will be the first out of the crisis, and they will be alive and kicking and seizing all the opportunities that will arise as well from the crisis. So, and of course, our companies will have a certain vulnerability. I think that is clear to everybody, of us. And we have to make sure that our companies then have the right tools as well to diversify their supply chains, to diversify their markets. And therefore, I think it is in the whole recovery package that we are working on very and crucially important that we foresee an envelope that gives grants and that gives funds to our companies for in the strategic sectors. I mean, we can't say do this to everybody. The money we have is not unlimited, but when we are talking artificial intelligence, when we are talking 5G, we don't want the dependency on China in these crucial strategic points. And I think we all agree, and therefore we have to foresee an envelope for diversification, for more resilience, more autonomy, if you want to call it like that, even if we know that that we can't cut everything off. I think the resilience of our companies is something very important, and therefore we should grant that in these key areas we set the rules right now, and that we, as well as Parliament, ask strongly for an appropriate envelope to do so. And by that, I would like to close. I think we agree that the crucial importance of our Chinese partner, but I think we have as well, we are not just a partner, we are a competitor, and sometimes even an enemy. We have to consider that and give us the right tools to react appropriately to that. And I think, therefore, we really need not just now help our companies during the current crisis, but make a real substantial envelope for them for the future development and for diversification. That is, in my opinion, crucial. And this will as well allow us to speak more at the same level with China than we are able to do it today, because we have a lot of our European companies that are active in China, but it's always compared to China, US, we are still small, so we have to see how we can put more weight into that whole discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, Christoph, Mr. Hansen, thank you so much for your contribution. Good points and very good questions. I liked and appreciated very much what you said about European autonomy, and indeed having this strategic balance between our engagements with the US and China, respectively. That was very good. Next up is Mr. Philip Torbo, who is a founding partner at the Brussels office of KL Gates, which is a law firm. He's got a very solid background in legal background with experience in European trade law and investment law. So thank you very much for joining, Philip. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tudor. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been very interesting to listen to all the views on China going forward. the relationship with the United States. Do we have to choose between China and the United States? I think it's a bit like a discussion about choosing between friends. It's possible to have friends that are different. It's possible to have friends that don't share the same values that you necessarily share. It's possible to even have friends that perhaps, you know, are not your friends every day, but that you like to see every now and then, and that you enjoy, not together necessarily, but, you know, you have to pick your moments. But what's important, the most important thing here is to accept your friends as they are. And one of the discussions here is, do we have to change China? Do we have to change the United States? No, but we do have to make sure that we don't change. And there's been a lot of discussion about values. And for me, and for the long-term viability of European economy, of European trade, it is important that we in Europe set our values right. We have had difficulties with that. And we've had difficulties perhaps because of the way that the EU functions, that the EU has been set up to promote trade, to promote competition. Companies, member states consider that these are the main virtues and duties of the EU. In fact, if you look at the EU, the areas where the EU has full competence are competition and trade. So this is what the EU is meant to do. Now, over the years, we've developed a more political dimension of the EU, but we're still missing some areas. And some of the key areas that we're missing is, for example, security. And it's clear that over the last few years, there's been some real challenge on security when it comes to trade. Huawei has been mentioned, and there's not only Huawei. We've been seeing articles and discussions about airport security as well, where the Chinese are taking over the market of airport security with all the issues that come along in terms of collecting data, strategic position, etc. And a problem is that these issues are quite difficult for the EU to tackle the way that it has been traditionally functioning. So from my perspective, we need to do a couple of main things. We need to, one, set our values and agree on our values going forward, not only towards China, but generally towards our trading partners. The United States don't share all our values. It's true that they will share more values. They're a democracy to begin with, and they value the rule of law, something that in China is not the case. The rule of law in China does not exist very much, certainly not in relation to the state. And our problem has been that we have generally expected our trading partners to function the way we do. They don't. So we need to set our values, but also accept that when we deal with our trading partners, the United States, but particularly China, it functions very differently. And take that into account. Give our trade agreements, give our instruments the flexibility that is required when you deal with a partner like China. When China commits to a market access on the paper, it doesn't mean that you will get market access in practice, because whatever is written in law in China is not necessarily the way that things work. It's not like here. And these are all, you know, not to mention, you see, privacy, data, you know, and it, you know, it's a little hard, you know, when a company, when big companies, Chinese big companies, say that they will never send data to the Chinese government that they collect in Europe or the United States. You know, you may want to question that, because in the end, in China, if you want to be in business, you are depending on the government, and the government doesn't really care what commitments you may have made orally to the United States or to Europe. So it's just a matter of accepting our trading partners, our friends, different values, and say, look, we take them as they are, but we take that very much into account when we negotiate with them. And first and foremost, we stand for what we are. We value privacy, we value data, we value environmental protection. Yeah, we can perfectly incorporate that in our trading negotiations. We value competition. We don't only want competition on the paper. We want competition, in fact, in the market. So you're welcome to come to Europe, but you have to be competing on a level playing field. In fact, not just on the paper. Same thing when we go to China. We want to have the access that was promised to us. And WTO, yes, we may need it more than ever, but we don't have it. Now we have to do without it probably for a long time. So it's all about growing in Europe and be proud of what we have, proud of our values, agreeing on that, and going out like as such. And then probably looking very carefully, especially now after the Corona crisis, looking at strategic sectors. It's a time to think about things. It will not be cheap. And I think that the problem with, that a lot of our companies are thinking is, well, it all sounds very nice, but what will it cost us if Europe starts standing for its values? It will cost. It will cost in the short term, probably. But I would say that we can't afford to not do it for the long term. That's my conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, for that sober analysis, discussing also fair competition, market dynamics, and indeed the complexities of a friendship between rather different players. Now, I would like to turn the floor back to our two keynote speakers, and with the risk of being a tad distressing, I have two questions of my own. If I may, very quickly to Mr. Wutke, we very much appreciate your experience on the ground. And given that we are here at SME Europe, I have an SME related question. I understand that the People's Bank of China has been contemplating or coming up with some measures to stabilize the economy through adjustments to monetary policy. And I understand that some of these are targeting especially small and medium-sized enterprises. Could you shed some light, please, on this for us? And secondly, to Mr. Weigel, we are very much, we have been rather concerned in the International Trade Committee about the compatibility between the recently concluded GIs agreement between the EU and China and the Phase 1 deal between the US and China. Chatter is at the same time that there might be some issues with the Phase 1 deal in terms of terminating this agreement or at least suspending it. Could you comment a little bit on this and also tackle some of the questions raised by our discussants? Thank you so much. We will take an opposite round order this time. So President Wutke, you have the floor, sir.
I am, wait. I think I'm muted.
No,
we hear you. We hear you good.
You hear good. All right. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the offer. This is not much time left. Let me start with your question. People's Bank of China stimulus, yes, they recognize the fact that SMEs are important. The translation mechanism from banks to SMEs is very, very difficult. The banks in China have been told to deleverage, to get rid of debt. And now they get told to lend to SMEs, which in many ways generate a lot of debt. So it's between a rock and a hard place. We have to see how that works out. We have a very able SME desk at our chamber, headed by a Spanish lady, Esther Canada Meya. And I would really say that when you have this question, Esther can provide you this information. I think she's even on the air as we speak. I just a couple of comments. First of all, Europe has to find strength and not look at others. I think that's actually what Europe has done. I mean, I really must say that over the last years, Europe has concluded an FTA with a lot of countries, particularly here in Asia, while actually having the long march with China in an investment agreement over which Ulrich got white hair by now. So in a way, it is really in our interest to keep doing FTAs to safeguard our operations. And if China simply doesn't want to go down this road of opening up, then tough luck. We should not jeopardize this. We should always put, as Phil Hogan says, substance before speed. And if the investment agreement is nothing that we can show home and actually contributes to our economy, then we should move on and see if there might be a better time later. So I guess we also have to be aware that Europe stands for multilateralism. We should safeguard WHO. As Phil Hogan said, we should definitely try to safeguard WTO. Hardly anybody talks about the T anymore. Everybody talks about the H. And we should see if, particularly maybe at one stage, if another government is in place in the White House next year, if TPP can come back, let alone TTIP, but that's a long shot. In a way, I think Europe has a major appeal. America and China, I think, are losing appeal drastically, very fast. Hence, Europe actually just has to sort out its own internal reform fatigue in order to shine and sparkle. We don't have to choose. We are definitely leaning more towards America for historical reasons. China has an autocratic system that I think that no one can support from the political side. But definitely China has an economy. We should not leave that aside because it translates into job back home. So Europe has a tremendous appeal in its multilateralism in the way that it translates. So I really would say in order to maintain the kind of heavyweight, we have to safeguard the euro. We have to be more united about this kind of thing. We don't have to look again to China and the US to make up our mind. We just have to look into all the kind of appeals and problems that we addressed. I have been 30 years outside Europe. I'm looking from afar, and it's agonizing sometimes to see how Europe gets sliced up and diced up. Again, unity of Europe. I mean, why do we accept 17+1? Why do we let China carve out countries and throw them into a pot with European Union members is really beyond me. The second is, of course, Belt and Road Initiative. It's a big hype, politically driven. The Chamber made the effort of going into a study which we have launched in January. China, we have 1,700 members and 138 sort of indicated an interest to reply to this survey. And the magnitude of 9 companies that saw some benefits somewhere in Belt and Road just tells you what kind of hype it is. 90-something% of the value in Belt and Road Initiative projects remain in China as services and hardware. Only 4 to 5% in local economies. In World Bank tenders, that is about 40%. And for European companies, between 2 and 3. Again, I have, say it again, 9 members benefiting. So I really don't get it why European countries and governments fall over each other in order to sign up to something which frankly doesn't benefit their employment scheme back home. Where's the unity to say, you know, China, show us what the benefit is, just don't talk about it, is something that really is agonizing to see when you are heading a business community here in a system which frankly is certainly not an easy one. So I would say the battle is not too late. The lady from the Greek side, very interesting what she said. The battle is not too late because China battles with its own inconsistency and challenges. You should not look at China from afar as seeing this as a juggernaut that will roll over us. China has tremendous headwinds, politically as economically, and then you know better the headwinds that the US is facing. Actually, when you are looking into these issues, you see that Europe, frankly, is doing not too bad. You know, our healthcare system is functioning to some extent better than most others. We have consensus style operational mode. Yes, we have problems that we can face, but we find somehow a mechanism. Here is suppression, and in America, it is terrible to see how the country is torn apart. So in a way, don't talk down Europe. We have our homework to do. Support us here by making sure that our backyard remains European, meaning no SOEs, only unless we permit them to operate there. That we keep hammering at the Great Wall of China in order to let European business do in China what China can do in Europe.
Thank you. Very clear message. Mr. Weigel? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And after that impressive plea by Jörg, it's hard to follow on. Just starting to say, this shows exactly the enormous value of the European Chamber in Beijing, in China, to our work as an inspirator, as delivering all the facts and assessments that help us getting our analysis and judgment right in reporting. Now, one thing I would like to start, and that's something you may have heard from my commissioner, is we want to address these crises on our own, on EU terms, in the way we tackle the different things, be it tackling the vulnerabilities or the multilateral, including the WTO and dispute settlement, or in continuing the homework that we have set out to do. And I would like to go back to the question of haven't we misunderstood China and tried to invade China becoming more like us. I think the March 2019 communication is a clear signal that the main thing we have to do is getting our homework right to create leverage for our interaction with China, be it on trade defense, be it on investment screening, or be it on the international procurement instrument, or the way we try to tackle the behavior of Chinese SOEs through competition tools. So these are the main axes there. On the investment screening, that initiative also goes back to a EU Chamber report on China Manufacturing 2025 in 2017. This screening now proves very valuable, as we have shown in a guidelines we have given to member states to protect essential assets now in this crisis against takeover bids, notably in the areas of health, of medical research, biotechnology, and infrastructures that are essential for our security and public order. So just to say, we are in the process of giving ourselves the tools to chart a European way forward. Now, having said this, you also mentioned the US, and this is an important topic to make sure that through what has been agreed between China and the US, and we're certainly not sitting at the table to be able to say how robust this is or what the current dynamics there are, but we see the outcomes of that deal. We also see the implementation done by China, and we are very keen to make sure that what is being done is not done to the disadvantage of European companies and member states competing in those sectors. We understand that at the same time, while we see that work on agriculture ongoing, and we have a very important and close look at that, follow it very closely, and make our own demands known to China. We know that the negotiation and the work on finalizing the GI agreement is ongoing. So that is ongoing and continues. I think there are quite a number of actions that are implementing what we have set out to do. The virus developments are not making it easier. They may accelerate things that we have seen, notably the high-tech developments and the new challenges that we may face there. And we have still to see how China is now coming out with its support measures and policy measures. But at least we are in the process, at least seen from here, that we give ourselves the tools to deal with that at home and to create leverage for our interaction with China. I think that is a path that would suggest to us there is some direction we can really follow. Allow me to come back to that SME question, and insert my little piece of wisdom. We followed studies who looked in detail at the monetary and the fiscal measures for SMEs. We have the perception that some of the things done, like creating simplification, helping SMEs on social security contributions, has been welcome. Access to credit seems, or is being said, is not so easy, not so effective, either because SMEs in that situation do not want to take out extra credit, or may not have the bank relationships to really make that work. But you're right in asking the question, because indeed the question of how can policymakers support SMEs and looking at China to see what works or what works less may be a useful thing to do.
All right, Mr. Weigel, thank you so much. Thank you for the completion on the SME point, and also for mentioning the China Manufacturing 2025. Had a big impact indeed on competitive neutrality in China, on the Chinese market. So this has been in the attention of the International Trade Committee as well. Now, before concluding myself, I would like to pass the floor on for some quick remarks to our host, Mr. Winkler, for some final thoughts.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief. I try to be brief since our time is already over. But first of all, thank you very much for all those very powerful and valuable remarks. One question about the one voice and about the coherency, and I would like to make a comment. European Union is huge, powerful and diverse. And of course, one European is very difficult, since in the European Union we are democracies, and democracy is about debate, and democracy is about, of course, slightly diverging interests or slightly diverging positions. We did not even discuss the 17+1 cooperation. So of course we have a huge problem in having one voice. We should try to have. China, at the other hand, is even bigger. It's increasingly powerful, and it's also diverse, but it is also a one-party state. So one voice is not so difficult for China, but coherency is difficult. And we can see that the one Chinese voice is not always coherent with itself. It was not even coherent in the last 2 months, if I remember correctly. So one conclusion on this: we should continue our dialogue, not abandon our values, not abandon our interests, and be very, or if it's possible, be more realistic, as Anna Michel rightly said about the difference between the EU and the United States in approaching China. Now, I would like to make a final remark on SME Europe of the European People's Party, because I think it was important that all speakers referred to the small and medium enterprises. That's very important for us. As you could see, it's a huge and qualified interest on behalf of the European People's Party. Anna Michel and myself, we are vice chairs of the International Trade Committee, and Christoph Hansen is our coordinator in the EPP members of the International Trade Committee. We are putting so much value in our cooperation with the EU CCC. And Jörg Wütke, thank you very much for your participation. I never cease to emphasize that you are our legitimate source of information and expertise on the ground. That's how EPP considers you. And of course, our delegation to Beijing, thank you very much for all the information. And I think that it was a lot of added value, even if we did not succeed in answering some comments on the participants' Q&A. But that will mean that we have to come back with continuation of such a discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Winkler. Indeed, apologies to the Q&A participants. We did not have time, unfortunately, but we will make sure to have another event soon on China. Now, coming to the conclusions, as customary here with our webinars, there are no black and white answers. It is very difficult to say what we really are. What we know is that given the intricacy and the complexity of the international system currently, we can concomitantly be partners, competitors, or systemic rivals. Given the EU posturing as a pragmatically idealist international actor, we can indeed robustly defend our values, while also keeping in mind that strategic economic cooperation is very much necessary. So indeed, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for participating today. It was a very valuable event. And now that the network is here, we are happy to continue the discussions, and we are definitely going to monitor closely the 10 points and others in the International Trade Committee and in Brussels, generally speaking. So thank you very much again, and hope to see you soon. Be safe and all the best.